Today I'm out in Tennessee driving the all-new Nissan Armada, also known as the Nissan Patrol around the world. This is Nissan's full-size SUV designed to compete not just with the Chevy Tahoe, but obviously with the Land Cruiser internationally. Let's talk about what you get under the hood on the inside, how much it's going to cost, and of course, we're going to drive this on-road, off-road, and tow with this, because that's one big reason to get this over the Pathfinder. You'll get 8,500 pounds of standard towing. But before we get to all that, let me just grab the camera and we'll go for a look around the outside of this Platinum Reserve trim. The front end design is definitely different than the previous generation Armada. For 2025, the Armada and Patrol were designed in unison and they basically look exactly the same on the outside. There is a little bit of the previous V-Motion grille in terms of style going on up front, but also interestingly, this does not look like the new Murano or the Kicks or the Aria, which have a very different Nissan design language. This is certainly more trucky. We have these very distinctive sort of number 3 styled LED DRLs and turn signals up front, of course LED headlights below. Since this is the Platinum Reserve trim, we have really big wheels on this particular model, wrapped in Bridgestone Alenza tires. The tires themselves, those are not as wide as I thought they might be, 275/50 R22s. I'd kind of expected slightly wider tires. Moving around the side, you can see that Nissan opted for a very boxy and upright design in this generation. They really wanted to give this maximum cargo capacity, and it is a little bit longer than the outgoing model, but still easier to park than some of the American full-size SUVs. In the back, we no longer have that sort of awkwardly sticking out lower bumper, and that means that if I open this hatch for a second, it is a lot easier to load cargo in and out. The previous model, you really had to reach quite far in order to get things in and out of the back. You don't have to do that anymore. They've put the hitch receiver under this plastic panel. I'll show you that in just a moment in one of the other trims. And of course, we have taillight modules that, as you can see, mimic that shape going on up front. Full LEDs, of course. Depending on the trim level you get, there will be an LED light bar stretching right across the rear. If you're looking for something a bit more rugged, you might want to check out the Pro 4X. We get a modified front end design with these 3 faux air intakes above the grille. They're right in line with the DRLs and the turn signals, giving this definitely a very interesting look. We of course get the orange accents you'd expect in a Pro 4X trim, and we do get recovery hooks as well, but they're tucked way up under the bumper. Actually, let's take a look at those, because you can see this one's been off-roading a bit today. It's pretty muddy under there, and those recovery hooks are just a little bit muddy. Their location is likely due to certain crash safety regulations around the world. And remember, again, this is the global market Patrol. The Pro 4X also gets the adaptive height air suspension. We get all-terrain tires, although these Geolandar all-terrain tires are not the most all-terrain that I've seen. You can see that they definitely don't eject mud quite as readily as something like a KO2 or KO3 would. But thanks to the adaptive air suspension, we get more ground clearance, we get better approach, breakover, and departure angles. Out back, we don't have any dedicated recovery hook locations either in the bumper or underneath, but Nissan says you can, of course, use the hitch receiver back here for a recovery location. We have a full-size spare tire, but it's not a matching all-terrain full-size spare tire. So it's not the exact same tire that we find on the sides, although logically you could put one of those in yourself. Let's take a closer look at the hitch setup in this Pro 4X trim. It has its cover removed and a trailer connected. As you can see, we have a 7-pin harness over there, no 4-pin harness. I do love that double harness setup in a lot of vehicles. Over here, we seem to have plenty of room for some of the larger safety chains. That's a complaint I've made in a few other vehicles, and the receiver does stick out just enough from the back end of the vehicle to make it pretty easy to connect. Under the hood, we find a major change for this generation. Gone is the thirsty V8, and in its place is a significantly more powerful twin-turbo V6. 3.5 liters. It's based on the GTR's engine, of course, with a lot of changes for truck duty under this hood. 425 horsepower, that's 25 more than the outgoing V8. 516 pound-feet of torque, that's a whopping 103 pound-feet more than we got in the old engine. Also, there's a new transmission. It's the 9-speed automatic transmission, basically borrowed out of some of other Nissan's trucks. It's related to a Mercedes 9-speed automatic transmission design, interestingly enough. Now, we don't know exactly what the fuel economy rating of this engine is yet, but we know that in the QX80, it's rated for 17 mpg. Now, in the QX80, it gets a little bit more power because it's tuned for premium unleaded, and this one is tuned for regular unleaded. So if you're worried about having to feed this mid-grade or premium, don't worry. This is designed to run safely on regular octane. Jumping inside the Armada, the experience is quite logically very similar to the Infiniti QX80. The seat design, it's relatively similar as well. We find a 4-way adjustable lumbar support in this top-end Platinum Reserve trim and the available seat massage as well. If you want those features, of course, you're gonna have to work your way up the trim ladder. We also have a powered tilt telescopic memory-linked steering wheel. It's a new design. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. And the front passenger seat seems to have the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat, including the massage functionality. We also see an improvement to rear seat comfort for this generation. These seats are significantly more padded and more appropriate for adult use than the last generation Armada. Headroom, it's a little bit more limited than the front because of the way the panoramic moonroof is designed and the fact that the second row seats are a little bit higher off the ground than the front row seats. That's something that we see in a decent number of full-size SUVs. Also, if you're cross-shopping something like this against a big crossover like a Chevy Traverse or a Buick Enclave, keep in mind that a body-on-frame SUV is a little bit less space efficient because we have the body that we're sitting in, then we have a number of inches of frame, then we have the bottom of the vehicle. So there is that frame in between, which results in kind of a more squished body on top, I guess you'd say. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. As you can see, I have several inches of legroom left there. If I move over to the seating position where I was most comfortable driving, I only have a little bit more because it turns out I actually was sitting a little bit more back in the tracks than I normally do. Now, as far as rear passenger accommodations go, you can get a 3-person bench in the middle or these captain's chairs, but regardless of what you do, these seats tilt and slide forward in a manner that lets you leave a child seat latch anchored into place. That's a feature I really love, and it's a feature that Nissan really helped pioneer in some of their vehicles not that long ago. We have well-positioned latch anchors on this seat and one back there in the third row as well. I didn't bring a child seat with me, but I have my handy-dandy tape measure, so let's see how this should stack up. Looks like we're going to get about 32 inches between this seat back and the driver's seat back, adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. That's definitely enough room for even some of those larger rear-facing child seats. And again, the added practicality of that tilt-slide mechanism. As with many things in life, there are pros and cons to this seat design. You can fold the seats flat for improved cargo capacity behind the first row of seats all the way back there to the hatch, but these do not tumble forward, giving you that deeper storage area that you do find in a more traditional SUV seat design. Still, I find this the easier option. These seats are also a little on the heavy side, especially if you have one of those heavier forward-facing child seats latch anchored into place. Someone with upper mobility issues, they may have troubles actually flipping and folding those seats. But on the other hand, it's really easy to get in the back. We do have a somewhat more stadium seating arrangement in here than we find in some large SUVs. So back here in the back, you'll notice less headroom is going on than something like a Wagoneer or of course the Ford Expedition. This is a slightly tighter third row than average, but we still have 3 seats back here, 1 extra set of latch anchors, and I think for most folks this is going to be pretty comfortable, except if you're on the tall side of things. If you're much over maybe 5'10", you're definitely going to be hitting your head on the ceiling, and the headrests, they kind of hit you in a peculiar place in the back. Let's check out the child seat position back here, just in case you're wondering. Do the same measurement back here. And then we have 26 inches of room between that seat back and that seat back right there. That might be a little bit tight for those rear-facing seats, but that gives you an idea of the kind of interior room that we find in here. Let's start the interior tour back here in the third row of the Platinum Reserve trim. As you can see, the shoulder belt for the center position comes out of the ceiling there. That's not my favorite position, but it is just one seat. We have these really tall headrests I mentioned earlier. You can see how tall they are up off the seat back, but they do hit me kind of weirdly between the shoulder blades at my height. We have lots of hard plastics back here, so no soft touch armrests or anything like that for the third row, but we do have power recline seats back here, and we have USB-C charge ports on the side, also tons of cup holders and air vents that are located up here in the ceiling. That's my favorite place for them, although I think I actually like those round air vents that we see in some of the competition because you get to direct the air around a little bit better. Moving up to the second row, we have fixed in-place shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable head restraints, more of those air vents in the ceiling along with grab handles, and we get a dual grab handle design, which I really appreciate. I recently had some elderly family members in my personal vehicle which didn't have any assist handles in the back, and that kind of highlighted their importance for some people. Moving down, we find more soft touch plastics here in the second row, so soft touch armrest, squishy upper bits, lots of stitching going on. Still hard plastics in the middle of the door panel and at the lower portion as well. Clip speaker grills there. The front seat backs, those are backed in soft touch materials as well. We have a lot of contrast going on here. So charcoal, sort of a medium brown, then sort of a chestnut brown, I guess you'd say right there. So definitely lots of different color choices. Armrests right there on the side. These are ratchet in place armrests, and then you reset them by going all the way back. We have a small center console here with more USB-C charge ports, 2 cup holders, then even more USB-C charge ports up here. Then the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control and the heated rear seats. Moving to the front row, we find height adjustable shoulder belts. Here's a better look at that panoramic moonroof. As you can see, it definitely cuts down on headroom a little bit, but it's a pretty decently sized glass. The front portion is the only one that opens, and that is the smaller pane. So if you want a really big opening sheet of glass, you might find that elsewhere. Here's a better look at the front seat design with the quilted leather and the 3-tone color scheme going on. So charcoal, medium, and a darker brown. These are definitely very comfortable seats. They're the latest Nissan zero gravity design, and Nissan's always made some pretty comfortable seats. Moving over to the front doors, it's a very similar design to the back doors. You can see that stitching there, the contrasting material with more aggressive texture. Still hard plastics around that portion of the door, including down there around the bottle holders and storage areas. Moving over to the dashboard, we find a subtle amount of faux wood trim running through the interior. This does appear to be imitation wood. Hopefully there'll be a correction on that, and I will pop a note on screen if it turns out to be real tree. We have stitched upper sections of the dashboard, stitched mid sections of the dashboard, and then a medium-sized slot-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside, but speaking of large tablet computers, check out what's going on the dashboard. We have a twin 14-inch screen setup here in the dash. Now, this is optional. If you get most of the trims, you'll find 12-inch screens in the dashboard. You have to step all the way up the ladder in order to get the 14-inch screens. But what's kind of cool about this system is that Nissan doesn't just use one camera for certain settings. Depending on the camera mode that you are in, you can expand these cameras out to both screens. For instance, if we're in this mode where we're taking a look at the forward view camera and we're checking out that ProMaster van and the tent, I can expand that out to use both screens. Here's a sort of a view from the driver's perspective. This is kind of handy if you're in a tight parking maneuver situation, or if you're in a limited access area where just the nose of the vehicle can peep out and you want to look both ways out the front. Of course, we get our pretty typical 360-degree views with tire views, things like that. And Nissan has one of the better 360-degree camera systems, I still think, in the business. We also, of course, have the Apple CarPlay or Android Auto interface wireless with the optional Google Mapping interface. Google Maps is not standard, interestingly enough, but this is running the latest software and basically the same software that we see in, of course, the Infiniti QX80 with the seat massage settings there. We have some duplicate controls for the climate control up top, and then physical controls for that climate control system below. Here we find big air vents, camera button, track forward, backward, etc. Some of those climate control buttons, including physical buttons for seat heating and ventilation. This is the drive mode selector. It's a pretty easy to dial knob. Of course, we have those various different drive modes there. Blank switches, which does surprise me a little bit. There are a few options, of course, that this one doesn't have that you'll find only in the Pro 4X, like the lockers, but I still kind of think they could have ditched the blank buttons. We have a push button shifter design here, and then button to disable the auto start stop system and adjust the air suspension. Big cup holders going on in the center. One wireless charging mat. I would have kind of liked to have seen two, because we don't have a bulky column shifter here, console shifter. We have the buttons which minimize space utilization, but they could have given us maybe more storage room. We have a roller style cover there for that area. Pretty big center armrest with a divider that reveals a deep storage well. So that should give you some idea of the storage space we have available. Then there is a little storage slot down here, and I do say slot because I'm not sure what you could put in there. Larger purses definitely wouldn't fit, but maybe something like a clutch. Over here we have the integrated trailer brake controller. This one apparently hasn't had its plastic removed from it, but it's a pretty truck-based design. Start-stop button over there for the engine, and then the new steering wheel design over here. It's a nice, thickly rimmed, leather-wrapped, padded steering wheel, so it's very comfortable in the hand. We have a combination of touch and physical controls for things over here. This whole button module moves, as you can see, flexing around there, and then it knows what option you've selected by where exactly you've touched the module. This is becoming all the rage lately, but the shiny black plastic does leave me concerned about scratch marks in the future. And that's something I should actually comment on for this center bank as well. This area might become scratched over time. I will say it doesn't show any fine scratches yet, but this vehicle only has 1,300 miles on it. Fortunately, some of the other black plastics around are more of the scratch-resistant variety, like around the door handles. That's an area where I really dislike having those shiny black plastics. This does not have that problem. It has more of a textured look. Also around the window switches, that has that textured look that resists scratches pretty nicely as well. On this side, we have some additional buttons for things like the head-up display, the steering assistance system, and then the controls for the adaptive cruise control. They're over there with paddle shifters on the back. On the inside, those button blanks I mentioned earlier are used for the four-wheel drive system. We were driving a rear-wheel drive model previously, so you would get these buttons there, but you won't be getting the rear diff locker unless you get the Pro 4X, which also adds Pro 4X logos embroidered on 4 of the headrests, and an orange Nissan logo on the steering wheel with orange accents all around. On the cargo front, we don't have a separately opening hatch glass like we find in many full-size SUVs. On the other hand, we do have more cargo room than we find in the Toyota Sequoia, because the Sequoia's battery pack really eats into third-row usability as well as the cargo area. You'll find a slightly deeper cargo area in some of the full-size competition, which means that you could put 24-inch roller bags in this position, but in this vehicle, a 22-inch roller bag like this is about all that will fit. And you can't put it quite close to the edge because you need some clearance for the window frame on the hatch. But you could put about 4 or maybe even 5 of these roller bags back here in a pinch. There's also, if I remove the bag from the back, lift up this, there's a little bit of storage space under there, but it's not a huge storage cubby in the back. We of course have a spare tire, but that's located under the vehicle. It's worth noting that if you're looking for more cargo capacity and you still want to seat the same number of passengers, you might want to check out a General Motors full-size crossover, because something like an Enclave or the Acadia, you'll actually be able to put more cargo in the back of those. But they're not going to have an adaptive air suspension like this model, and they're not going to tow nearly as much. I really appreciate the air suspension controls back here, because you can actually use this in a number of different ways. You can use it to enable loading and unloading of cargo into the back a little bit more easily, or you can actually use it to help hitch up a trailer, because you can drop the suspension down, back up, and then jack the suspension right back up onto the trailer. All right, it's time to get this out on the trail. Logically, one reason to buy a full-size body-on-frame SUV is for the increased off-road capability, because the four-wheel drive system on board is very much like you'd find in the average half-ton truck. We have a true transfer case with the low ratio modes. We have 4 high, 4 low, and of course 4 auto. Auto mode is going to try and apportion power front and rear automatically based on traction situations here. It's going to use a clutch pack to send power around, and it can fully lock and send 100% of engine power to the front axle when that coupling is completely locked. The dimensions of the Armada make navigating trails like this a little bit easier, because this is relatively tight, but keep in mind this is no small SUV. This is not a Wrangler or a Bronco, especially the 2-door varieties. But we have actually very similar kinds of four-wheel drive capability in here to those kinds of vehicles. But Nissan has made some somewhat unusual decisions with the off-road systems in this vehicle. For instance, you cannot change the adaptive height of the suspension manually. You only have the auto mode, or you can lock it into various heights once the suspension has achieved a particular ride height. You don't have the ability to toggle up and down like you do in something like a Grand Wagoneer or a Wagoneer, something along those lines. Like many full-size SUVs in this segment, you can engage the rear diff locker in 4 high or in 4 low, but not in 4 auto. In the other modes, it's going to be just relying on the traction management systems. Nissan has set up some moguls here, so I am deliberately not going to use the rear locker just to see how Nissan's traction control is set up here and see how it does in this kind of situation where you have different wheels up in the air. This is also a good time to talk about the off-road cameras. I really appreciate all of the various views that Nissan gives us, especially this widescreen view that we have up front. Of course, we have a spotter to help us get aligned here, but let's see how this does in the moguls. Got a back wheel up in the air. Traction management system's doing a pretty decent job sending power around. Actually, a surprisingly good job there, because in this situation, when you really are needing power to be moving around here, we don't really get any appreciable slip before the system sends power around to the other side using the brakes. Of course, for the best traction, you are going to want to use the diff locker in the back. All right, let's get the Armada out on the road. The first thing you're going to notice is that we do get a little bit of turbo lag, and then we get a whole lot of power. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 6.7 seconds, although I will caution you that I am not sure what our altitude is here. It has been pretty cold this morning. It was actually 27 degrees last night. A lot of things are still frosty out there, and of course temperature does change the performance numbers. And it has an effect on braking distance. In this model, it took 128 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. I suspect that's going to be a decent amount shorter when we get this at home and test it around 60 degrees, which is where we usually try and do most of our testing temperature-wise. Performance is pretty solid, and the 9-speed automatic transmission shifts pretty quickly, and it has a decent number of ratios to choose from, which is one big advantage of this transmission over the old 7-speed that we used to see in the Armada. It's pretty obvious if I just slow down here, we're going about 50 miles an hour or so, and say you needed to pass someone on a road like this, floor it, a lot of power right away, and there's a good ratio for the transmission to select, which is the important part as well. Power is no good if you don't have a good ratio to shift into that's actually usable for what you're trying to do. As you'd expect in a modern body-on-frame SUV, Nissan did a solid job isolating the cabin in terms of road noise and wind noise. Really, the only major sounds you get in here are sounds from the engine, which are pretty pleasing. And you do get a bit more of that engine sound in the cabin than you get in the Wagoneer with the inline 6, and I would say a little bit more than something like an Escalade as well. I suspect that for many Armada shoppers, the competitive elephant in the room is not going to be the American trio of full-size SUVs. It's actually going to be the Toyota Sequoia. The Sequoia, of course, now has a hybrid system standard, but it's not my favorite hybrid because of its design. It's not as smooth as the typical Toyota hybrid system, and it's not as efficient either. You get a very minor bump in efficiency, and you have to give up a decent amount of smoothness with that system. But my bigger complaint about the Toyota Sequoia actually is not the hybrid system, which I think is fine. It's the rear suspension. They borrowed it basically out of the Toyota truck line. And Nissan did not do that. They didn't just graft on a Nissan Titan under the body of the new Armada. This has a unique frame, a unique body, a unique suspension system in the back, and it's fully independent, which is not what we find in the Sequoia anymore. Instead, the Sequoia's live axle means that it's kind of rough over broken pavement. It kind of skitters and jumps over broken pavement. It doesn't give you as comfortable of a ride either, especially for people in the third row. Now, on the other hand, fuel economy is going to be a bit better in that Toyota thanks to the hybrid system. So far today, we've been averaging 20 miles per gallon over a day of mixed driving. Nothing terribly high speed, nothing terribly strenuous, but that's a reasonable improvement over the outgoing Armada, which really struggled to get into the mid-teens even. Even if you were being really gentle out on the open highway, you probably wouldn't be cracking 20 miles per gallon terribly often. And in this, if you keep the speeds to 65 or so, you're definitely in the 20 mpg range, even in the models with four-wheel drive. Now let's get a Pro 4X out on the road with a trailer on it. This trailer weighs 6,675 pounds dry with a maximum GVWR of 8,800 pounds. If we can get the official curb weight of this trailer, I will actually pop it in the video. But as you can see, it is a pretty decently sized Airstream, especially given the general dimensions of the Armada in front of it. As we get this out on the road, we should talk about the drive modes, because of course there is a tow mode in the Armada, as you'd expect with something with an 8,500 pound tow rating, and that's going to adjust the way the adaptive dampers work. Obviously, only if you have the adaptive dampers, that is, because this is available with a regular steel spring suspension as well. It's going to keep the auto height mode from adjusting out on the road. One unusual thing about this air suspension is that this is the only air suspension I can think of where you cannot manually adjust the ride height of the vehicle. All you have is auto, or you can disable it. Those are your only two choices. So if you're in the tow mode, it's going to keep that ride height at a consistent level. Of course, it's also going to function as a load leveler back there on the rear axle. It's going to tweak the damping profile ever so slightly, steering, and of course the transmission shifts as well. One interesting twist is that, at least for the moment, you'll only find the integrated trailer brake controller you've seen in the dashboard in the top 2 trims of Armada. There are going to be pigtails in the dashboard in every other trim to accept an aftermarket trailer brake controller, but if you want this factory integrated look, at least for the moment, you have to opt for the top 2 trims. There are a solid number of 3-row mid-size SUVs that'll tow around 6,000 pounds. Yes, this is tested according to the latest SAE standard for testing validation, and of course, we have about 6,500 pounds in the rear, but you could logically tow 6,500 pounds with another mid-size SUV if you really wanted to push it. But it's not going to have the feel that you find in a full-size body-on-frame SUV. The fact that we have the isolation of the body and the frame being separate, whereas the trailer is of course connected to the frame, means you don't get that rattling hitch sound in the cabin like you do in something like a Durango or even something like a Grand Cherokee with solid towing numbers, but they're unibody SUVs, so they're going to have a different feel out on the road. Then of course we have that twin-turbo V6 with a lot of low-end torque that's really going to help you get up on the highway a lot better than the average midsize SUV with a naturally aspirated V6 engine. So it depends on the kind of weights you're towing and what you expect out of your vehicle in terms of feel when towing. This is going to be the better towing companion, even if you're not really pushing up there towards 8,000 pounds of weight. And it's worth noting that you can use the load leveling bars on this air suspension, and that's not recommended in every air suspension out there. So always read your instruction manuals before you hook up a load leveling hitch. On the downside, the relatively small engine displacement and of course the turbos mean that we don't have the kind of engine braking that you would get in a full-size SUV with the V8 engine. But there aren't very many of those options available anymore. You're basically looking at the GM SUVs at this point, because even Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer have gone inline 6 only. They actually have less displacement than we find in this engine. Now it's time to get down to brass tacks, because we finally know how much those brass tacks are going to cost. And fun fact, if you know the origin of that phrase, just leave that down there in the comment section below as well. When I first looked at the new Armada, I thought it would be notably more expensive than the outgoing model, but turns out I was wrong. It's actually going to start at the exact same base price for the SV trim, $56,520, plus $2,100 of course destination charge, and if you want 4-wheel drive, that adds $3,000 to any trim level. The twin-turbo V6 of course is standard. That's going to give you significantly more power and a lot more torque than the outgoing V8, while also giving you better fuel economy, so I think it's a pretty decent deal. Now the base model, it's going to get the 12-inch screens, not the ones you saw inside this cabin, but it is going to get that 9-speed auto and the Safety Shield 360 system. I suspect a lot of shoppers are probably going to step up to the SL trim. That's going to give you the Google connected software, the Klipsch audio, and of course the ability to add the latest Nissan ProPilot hands-off-the-wheel steering assistance system. Now the SL trim, that is more expensive than last year. It's about a $2,600 jump, up to $62,970. And if you want that ProPilot 2.1 system, that's going to be $3,370 to add on to that model. The Platinum trim, that's next up at $69,930, and that's the first one where you're going to see the twin 14-inch screen setup that we have in this model. Then we have the Pro 4X trim, the off-road version that gives you the lockers and the air suspension. It's going to be the first one with air suspension for $73,740. Then we finally get the Platinum Reserve, which is the red model we've been looking at today. $76,990 is where this starts. You still have to add 4-wheel drive if you want that. And you also have to add the ProPilot system if you want that option as well. Although the option on this is going to be a little bit less expensive because it already includes some of the hardware included in that package. It's a $2,900 option instead of $3,370. Any way you slice it, that is more expensive than the last Armada, but it's actually a pretty good deal in the full-size SUV segment. Let me know, would you rather have this or would you rather have a Tahoe or an Expedition? The Expedition recently got a refresh. It got that clamshell hatch tailgate thing in the back. The Tahoe, it's received more modest changes over the last few years. You should also toss in the Jeep Wagoneer into this conversation. It's a direct competitor to this, although one might argue maybe a bit more of a competitor to something like the Infiniti QX80. There are a solid number of options in the US at the moment. The Armada has generally sold well because it was less expensive than most of them, and that is still a big reason to buy the Nissan over the competition, especially if you want to compare this to a Toyota Sequoia or something like a Lexus LX. It's a bit of a stretch, of course, for the LX, unless we're talking about the Platinum Reserve trim. I think it does compare relatively well there. Let me know what you think. I would certainly choose this if I was interested in high standard payload, if I wanted the big screens. The seats are very comfortable, but there are some logical reasons to choose the competition as well. Most notably, if you want an extended wheelbase version. There is no corollary to the Suburban or the stretched wheelbase version of the Ford or of course the Jeep in the Nissan lineup. That's something that, I wouldn't mind seeing, because I could see this design language stretched by maybe an extra 18 inches or so to give us something truly big. Other than that though, this is a solid option, and I certainly think it's one of the best looking options. I think this design is more attractive to my eye than either the Tahoe or the refreshed Expedition, or, interestingly enough, the Jeep Wagoneer as well. Something about the Wagoneer's design just seems a little bit unfinished to me, but I'd love to know it here. I'd love to hear what you think down there in the comment section below. Apparently it's too cold out here and my tongue is tied, so I will see all of you next week. Hopefully you are all somewhere nice and warm.